Hello. I just want to finish off about the Iron Curtain speech. I was part of the way through and I got cut off, so the video was too long. But anyway, the Soviets were occupying Eastern European countries against the will of most of these people, and it's true that they'd helped free them from the Third Reich. But that didn't mean that they wanted Soviets there permanently, who were not allowed to have fair elections, not allowing them to have free press or fair trials, or even leave the country, and imposing their own Stalinist brutal ideology, which had slaughtered so many million Soviet citizens on these unwilling countries which had had tiny communist parties until the Soviets showed up in 1944. But already in Greece, the Third World War had kicked off, as it were. The Greek communists had requested Uncle Joe's permission to launch a communist revolution. He'd refused because he wanted to keep this agreement going with the West. He thought this would jeopardize it. The West would say all the bets are off. But in spite of his refusal to grant his blessing, they went ahead, even without Stalin's say-so. So Stalin was incensed. He was the big daddy of the communist world. He had to be obeyed implicitly everywhere, so he refused to extend aid to them. They were eventually defeated, but the Greek government had a hard time holding the ring, and it doesn't suit the West to recognize that some of these Greek anti-communists had actually been collaborators with Germany and Italy during the war, but they just decided to turn Nelson's eye to that. So the British couldn't afford to fund the Greek government or need to fight the war. The UK was financially finished after the war, and that's when we were pulled out in 1947, which is where the United States stepped in, and that was when the Truman Doctrine was promulgated. But this is a year before that. The Chinese Civil War had already broken out in 1946. This uneasy alliance between the Kuomintang and the communists had broken down, and civil war was renewed. So Churchill had long been against Bolshevik baboonery, but he bears some of the responsibility for bringing the Soviets into Central Europe, because remember, he agreed to them having mastery over many of these countries. So the Soviets had dominion with his imprimatur. Now, I know he loathed communism, but he could have said, no, don't legitimate it. No, you're not allowed to keep your ill-gotten gains, your conquests of Poland, of Eastern Poland, which you did as an ally of Nazi Germany. So anyway, so this was very dispiriting. And one of the magnificent things about Churchill, I suppose, in democracy is that he could be defeated. And doesn't that ultimately vindicate the whole thing, that the people have the right to kick a leader out? Even someone who was so exalted as Churchill. He was ousted, he accepted the result, he bowed out, he didn't contest that for a moment, dispute what the result was. And so that's what democracy is. And it showed that the British people had a real choice, whereas the Soviets had none whatsoever. The Nuremberg trials were underway in 1946 to try and show the world what a fair trial was. The long telegram was sent later that year by George F. Kennan, that American diplomat in Moscow, to some extent inspired by what Churchill said, recognizing the increasingly insidious character of Soviet rule in Central Europe, though Churchill still hoped that a long-term accommodation could be reached. He was later to attempt rapprochement with the USSR again. Remember, Churchill came back as Prime Minister in October 1951, served until May 1955. Believing he was one of the big three, he had this connection to Stalin. He even went out of his way to say that he liked this man. And obviously Stalin died in 1953. Churchill was the last of the big three from the Second World War left alive, and thought that this made him some sort of elder statesman and able to connect with to Georgy Malenkov or Nikita Khrushchev, and that perhaps they could sort out worldwide disputes for the long term. It wasn't to be, despite Khrushchev's later rhetoric about peaceful coexistence. So there was this paradox at the heart of Churchill's career, seeking to oppose communism, which he immensely strengthened, or seeking to perpetuate the British Empire, though in fact he, of course, hastened its demise. Decolonization was apace during his second ministry, much though he preferred to resist it. And many of these erstwhile colonies, they beat a path to Moscow's door, which was sedulously disseminating anti-British propaganda throughout the world. So Churchill's his speech recognizing the increasingly dangerous nature of communism in Eastern Europe, just how barbarously oppressive it was, how they wished to spread their pernicious ideology throughout the globe, was headline news everywhere. It was a bit undiplomatic. I'm not sure the British government knew or approved. It was more candid than they would dare be. They were still hoping to get along with the Soviets and not to provoke the situation. The Soviets had proved their mettle, but obviously they had suffered very badly after the war. In some ways they were no fit shape to fight. So many of the men had been killed, so many of them had been wounded. And the thing is, the West was a little bit confident in 1946 because, of course, remember the Americans had the nuclear bomb and they proved it on Japan, and the Soviets didn't. The Americans assumed the Soviets would not get a nuclear bomb for at least 10 years. We obviously know that they got it only 3 years after this speech, and that negated America's enormous advantage. So that's a little bit about the significance of the Iron Curtain speech, which was perhaps the first speech to recognize that the Cold War was beginning to think that perhaps it could be halted, but Churchill was starting to realize that was unlikely. It was almost a forlorn hope. Well, that's just my penny's worth about the Iron Speech and some of its repercussions. It played badly in the Soviet Union, and they obviously depicted Churchill as an alcoholic, which he was, a warmonger, a racist, and really a Nazi himself, much of which was unfair. There we are, so please subscribe to my channel, book History Lessons Online with me. Toodaloo.